loss learning. I'm Emily Samos. I'm a consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, and we are really excited to have this opportunity to explore what the research shows about the effects of tutoring as a strategy to address the education crisis resulting from pandemic precipitated learning loss. This is part of a series of CGLR conversations on this topic, which began last week with a GLR Learning Tuesday webinar, followed by a consultative conversation on Friday that explored emerging proposals to scale high dosage tutoring, and will continue into the new year as we keep up the conversation on this important pillar of the campaign's efforts to slow, stop, and reverse learning loss. So for today's conversation, I am soon going to turn it over to our moderator, John Gompertz, the former president and CEO of America's Promise Alliance, and he will engage in a discussion with Dr. Mark Schneider, director of the Institute of Education Sciences at the U.S. Department of Ed. And we will then hear from our expert commentator, Dr. Monroe Richardson, who will share his comments based on his on-the-ground experience implementing evidence-based tutoring to improve early literacy skills. And then with the time left, John will invite comments and questions from all participants before we close out at 4 p.m. today. And just to get us started, I wanted to share a few quick housekeeping details. So first, we'd love for you to introduce yourself. So please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. And please be sure to select all panelists and attendees so that we can all know who's here. And all attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage your engagement by posting your questions and comments in the Q&A box. That helps us kind of really see those comments and questions that you want to bring forward. And you may be called on to share your thoughts later in the discussion. So we may be able to kind of put you on camera and put you off mute to share your comments. So please get those loaded up into the Q&A box as we continue the conversation. And we are recording today's conversation, and we will follow up with a link to that recording. And then anything that you see posted in the chat today will also be included in that follow-up email we'll send to you. So you'll have everything at your disposal. And so now I have the opportunity to turn it over to our great moderator, John Gompertz, again, the former president and CEO of America's Promise Alliance, who's going to launch our discussion. So welcome, John.
Thanks so much, Emily. We have a terrific turnout for a Friday afternoon, so thanks to everybody for joining. Absolutely. The turnout is a reflection of the high interest and positive energy about the potential for tutoring as a key part of the response to the learning loss that so many young people have suffered during COVID. Today, we're going to get thoughts on how to channel all that good energy towards successful programs and approaches. If we are all to advocate for deploying significant federal, local, private resources toward tutoring, then we need to get more detailed, more specific, and more rigorous than it sounds like a good idea. And this afternoon, we have just the right people to push us on this question about what is effective about high impact tutoring and when is it effective. Mark Schneider, as Emily mentioned, is the head of the Institute of Educational Sciences at the Department of Education. He's written recently about the possibilities for high impact tutoring as part of what they are calling Operation Reverse the Loss. And as Emily mentioned, Monroe Richardson from Reed Charlotte is one of the leaders in the GLR movement and someone who has been thinking hard about what it would take, what it would be like to adopt and implement intensive tutoring as part of the response to the learning loss caused by COVID. So with that, I'm going to ask Mark to lay out some of what he's been doing and thinking about and how he's specifically thinking about high dosage tutoring. And then I'll bring in Monroe for some reactions and some questions from Monroe. And then the three of us will have a conversation and we'll make it possible for others to join as well. With that, Mark, I'm going to turn it to you.
Thank you. So I'm going to do some background that's going to be more than just tutoring, but we're going to end up with thoughts about how we at IES are thinking about supporting tutoring. So tutoring, learning loss is a serious issue. We are trying to figure out what kinds of interventions are possible to reverse the loss. I do want to start with some more general issues, and then we'll narrow down to tutoring. So part of what we're doing is we've been putting out RFAs, requests for applications, that are trying to increase the efficacy of investments in education research. So we have a new RFA that's on the street just now, and it's called Transformative Education. And it's really an attempt to try to do something that ARPA does. ARPA Ed has been something that people have been talking about for a long time. There are many barriers to having a full ARPA Ed program, but what we're trying to do in this transformative RFA is high risk, high reward. Another issue that we're working on is to try to speed up research, and I think this is going to matter for when we get to tutoring, using digital learning platforms. So there are many platforms out there now that have over 100,000 students on them. The goal is to open them up for researchers to embed experiments using these learning platforms to learn quickly what's working and what's not working, and then to replicate. So this is like fail fast, things that work, replicate, fail fast, things that work, replicate, and ultimately the goal is to get to what works for whom under what conditions, which is our motto, which is IAS's motto. So we're going to announce a prize competition next week or the week or after New Year's that will be help us identify and spur the industry to open up these platforms for research. And I think one of the issues, we'll come back to this later, one of the issues with regard to tutoring is the degree to which we could use online delivery systems as compared to in-person ones, and to the extent to which we develop the platforms and we get people to use them for experiments, that will help enormously. That will help enormously in terms of evaluating tutoring. So Tuesday, I released a blog that talks about 6 different things that IAS is considering with regard to learning loss recovery. And I'm going to end with tutoring because that, of course, is the topic of the day for us. So the first one is we're calling Learning Pulse. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with the census pulse, the household pulse, and the small business pulse. So these are rapid turnaround, using government terms, of course, and government time schedules, relatively rapid turnaround of conditions on the ground. So the Learning Pulse, the household Learning Pulse, is designed to assess a quick turnaround on what households are going through. We education, IAS has been able to get several questions into the pulse about education. But the fact of the matter is we're arguing that we need a school pulse. And the first issue obviously would be measuring what's going on because of COVID. And then hopefully it'll live past COVID, and it will be used for us to sense the conditions in schools, the issues that are emerging in schools. So Learning Pulse is it's getting a lot of traction. We hope it works. A second issue that I think all of us are facing is like, how do we better harness data science for education research? So under the Evidence Act, IAS can't access big data systems in the Veterans Administration, in IRS, across the government. There has to be more sharing of data, but saying that we should share data and knowing how best to integrate and use those data are a task. And fortunately, data science is a growing field. We need to set up a data science unit within IAS. Right now, we are having a really hard time recruiting data scientists, in part because they're very expensive, and they have many more lucrative alternatives than government. But we're trying to figure out how to bring data science into our into IAS. The third is the ARPA Ed idea. So we're trying to, once we get a better sense of what the high risk, high reward transformative RFA looks like, we're going to try to push for a more systematic ARPA Ed kind of activity housed in IAS. We're an applied science agency. ARPA Ed is all about high risk, high reward bets. And that's our job. That's our job. The fourth one is fixing NAEP, the National Assessment of Education Progress. We had to postpone NAEP because of the school closings. That gives us a year to figure out how to more effectively and efficiently create the next generation of NAEP. Some of the things we have to do is we have to move it from in-person. So right now, the normal NAEP evaluation, assessment, sorry, involves sending somewhere in north of 3,000 people, test administrators, to 13,000 schools to physically administer the test to over 550,000 students. That is an enormous, yes, exactly, an enormous undertaking. So we have to create an eNAEP, which we're working on right now, but we also have to have other modern techniques such as automated scoring for student responses and automated item generation. If we can't bend the curve on our on NAEP, we're already running out of money. We will be forced to do less and less and less and less. I've also argued that we need, and this is going to be the bridge to tutoring, we need to restore at least $20 million to NICSR, the National Center for Special Education Research. That money disappeared in 2012 without a particular good reason. I think people were desperate for money, and they looked around and they said, oh, NICSR's small, let's just take the money from there. So why is that important? Well, because special ed students are right now suffering probably as much as any group of students in the country. And they're going to fall further and further behind. So the two groups of students that are, in my reading, are suffering the most are special ed kids, and the struggling readers and the people who, the below basic, if you will, on NAEP. So they've been falling behind. We've documented this over the years. The reading scores and the math scores of the bottom 10% of American students are going down. And at the 90th percentile, they're either going up or staying steady, which means we have a growing gap between the top and the bottom of the distribution. So the odd part about it, and not surprising mathematically, it makes sense, of course, is that the average scores in NAEP hardly move. But if you start looking at the distribution, you're seeing the growing gap. So we need to, and among the bottom are disproportionately special ed kids. So we're trying to figure out how best to increase our investment in special ed and improve the volume and the quality of the investment that we're making in special ed. So I'm going to come back to that with regard to tutoring. So tutoring is, as we all know, the what's the right word? The fix du jour. Like there's a lot of interest and a lot of activity trying to figure out how best to scale up tutoring and make it more widely available. So the reason is quite obvious why, and that is it has the most compelling evidence that tutoring can work. The effect sizes from a variety of experiments, from a variety of interventions is amazing, right? I mean, the effect size for almost everything we do hovers around 0. And now we're seeing effect sizes like 0.3, 0.4, which are pretty much unheard of. So the evidence is that tutoring works, but the problem is works for whom? And what does tutoring really mean? So Suzanne Loeb, who I hope there's a link to her work, has a paper that describes all the dimensions that make up tutoring. And it's like 10 pages. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, like, if we need to test all these 10 dimensions across demographies, across grades, across subject areas, I can't imagine where we have the capacity to do that kind of it's really needed research if we're going to get to the really fine grain targeting and matching of tutoring with populations. But it's an amazingly complex problem. So I'm thinking more like a much more simplified version of this. So what I'm thinking is we need to focus on age or grade against subject areas. So most of the work as you all know, is with regard to math and with regard to literacy. And early literacy and middle school math seem to have the strongest evidence. There's very sporadic, I think that's the right word, evidence that tutoring works for older kids. 1 or 2 studies, and the most compelling evidence that we have that tutoring can work for older students is coming out of the Education Endowment Foundation, EEF, in the UK. Because what happens there is that the age 16 test in the UK has enormous consequences for people's lives, right? I mean, if you don't do well on if you don't do well on those tests, you're shunted out of college, you're shunted out of universities, and your life chances go down. So the EEF, which is monitoring the national tutoring program in England, has evidence that for this kind of really high stakes testing for this population, for 16-year-olds, they have evidence that the tutoring programs are actually working. So this is the most compelling piece of evidence that I've ever seen that we could actually scale up or move up the age distribution for tutoring. So what I'm thinking is, what could IES do to propel tutoring? So the amount of money that people are asking for is a lot of money, in the vicinity of $100–200 million. And we're not an operational unit, we're an applied science agency. So we could and maybe should run some tiered evidence program like EIR for tutoring. And the advantage of having that in IES is that our commitment to rigorous evaluation and research would not get diluted, right? So we could imagine if we were running an EIR program, a tiered evidence program on tutoring, we would make sure that it was designed and implemented in a way that actually maximizes learning. I'm just worried that I3 and the EIR were much more committed to getting money out the door than on the evaluation and the rigorous evaluation in science, which is fine because I mean that was their job. So if we put this like an EIR program in IES, I think we would be much more likely to get rigorous science. So let me go back to what I can do. So I don't have $200 million sitting around. I don't have $100 million sitting around. I don't have $50 million sitting around. So, but we do have enough money to launch a rigorous, controlled tutoring program or a tutoring test. And I want to come back to that in a second, for special ed kids. So we're investigating, how much money we have and whether or not we could actually redeploy it for special ed tests. So as I said, we have to be really careful about age and age grade on one dimension and subject area on the other. And the third dimension for me are the things that make life so complicated in the US, demography, geography. So we have, and if we think about, age, grade versus subject versus various demographies, we have a very complicated cube. And the real goal should be to figure out which forms of tutoring work for any of those boxes in that cube, if you will. And the image that I have is that we need to do this at the program where we compete programs against each other, rather than doing like, oh, here are the 5 characteristics, which is what JPAL did. Here are the 5 characteristics of tutoring that seem to make it work, right? In class, I'm sorry, in school day, professional teachers, in person. I forgot what the 4th one is, but anyway, I mean, so a lot of the work has been identifying the characteristics of tutoring programs that work. And I think actually what we really need is identifying programs that work and the degree we could scale them up. So sorry, a long thing to what we're actually thinking about doing within the budget that we have. So we all know that for everybody, for fourth graders, regardless of special ed status, ratios and fractions turn out to be a major stumbling block. And if you're in fourth grade and you can't get that right, the foundation for progress in math is pretty difficult. Special ed kids in particular have this problem. So what we're thinking of is an RFA that would focus on fourth, fifth, sixth grade math for special ed kids. So this is something that we could afford. It's something that's fundamentally important because so many special ed kids are, falling further and further behind because of COVID. And again, that's just accelerating a problem that we've had before. So what would happen if we set up a bake-off? Again, I don't mean to be facetious, but we should be working on program comparisons, right? Rather than asking a principal to find the tutors and figure out the curriculum and all this. Well, there are plenty of programs, not plenty, but maybe 20 programs that have really compelling evidence of effectiveness. So if we put out an RFA, and the RFA would be two things. Your programs hardly ever touch special ed kids. So can you make a compelling case that your program will work for special ed kids with regard to ratios, fractions, fourth grade, fifth grade math? And the second thing that we absolutely must test is the degree to which this could be done online. So most of the evidence about online is that some programs can manage this. But when we get to like really fancier stuff using AI to do, intelligent tutoring, the evidence, and Bob Slavin's on, I know is in the audience, the evidence on this is that it has not worked. It does not produce strong effect sizes. But is that because these are old versions of AI? Is this because the wrong people designed it? Is it really possible? Should we not be in the business of trying to do online tutoring, which has evidence that it's not as good as in person, but not bad. And we, because of cost considerations, that's something we have to think about, and we would want to build that into any RFA that we run. And then my belief is that we have to do some forcing to try to get better intelligent tutoring built into and test this modern form of tutoring. And so one of the things about in education investments and education research is that most things don't work, right? So if we try to take existing tutoring programs and say modify these for special ed, what we have to hope is that some of them are going to work, right? And many of them won't. If we say these must be online, then we'll have the same issue with platforms, rapid testing, rapid failure, replication. But that's part of our business. That's part of the model that we've been pushing. And then if we say, okay, tell us why we should invest in your version of artificial intelligence for intelligent tutoring. Again, that's high risk, but it could be high reward. So I hope, my plan is to launch an RFA for tutoring for special ed. And if Congress decides to put more money into tutoring programs, I'm hoping that IS has a role, because a big role, because we're so strongly committed to science and to evaluation. So with that, I'm going to stop, and Monroe or John, it's back to you.
Thanks, Mark. That was extraordinarily helpful. Really appreciate that. Monroe, I'm going to give you a second to sip your water so you're all set to go. And then love to hear your reactions, and if you have any questions specifically for Mark, and then I'm going to jump back in and engage both you guys.
Okay, great. Well, First, thanks for having me. I think a lot of Mark, what you describe is really exciting. I can't help but think about this extraordinary year we've had where January 1, none of us knew that we were going to have this virus sweep through our country as part of this global pandemic. And here we are on December 11th, and we already have, we're close to having the FDA approve the first vaccine. And when I think about that, and I think about how we have somehow bent the laws of physics around developing a vaccine for this virus, I can't help but think about how do we bend the laws of physics to develop what I think of as educational medicine for our children, vis-a-vis tutoring. So I can't imagine how we get there without a strong role for IES, and I'm excited about the things that you're thinking about. I can't agree more with you about the questions of what works for whom under what conditions. And the only addendum I would suggest is, and for what outcomes. And I would say if there's anything that, I think a lot about is not all tutoring is equal. And I think your questions about what is tutoring, those are spot on. When I think about literacy tutoring for early literacy, I kind of break it down into three parts. So there's code focus kind of skills, but I think of those as two parts. There's the tutoring that's needed to help children with basic word reading. And then there's tutoring that's needed to help children with fluency. And those can overlap, but I see those as distinct through the work we've done here in Charlotte. But then there's another set that's meaning focused, skills, vocabulary, comprehension, that sort of thing. And, I've looked at a lot of peer-reviewed papers. I've been all over the What Works Clearinghouse, Evidence for ESSA, 30 databases. I've never seen a tutoring program that can do everything for every child. So, adding that in with your good points around grade level, I think that's really important. I would also suggest that one of the most important frameworks that's helped me think about this is actually research that IES has helped fund and support the scale up, but it's Carol Connor's really great research on the 4 types of reading instruction, the fact that kids need different amounts of those, instructional minutes of those 4 types of reading instruction. And when I think about tutoring these days, my question is, which of these 4 types are you organized around that we're helping, get children what they need? I think the other thing that I'm also trying to think about is, Mark, you mentioned fit, which is so important. And when we think about the variety of communities we have big urban centers, we've got more rural communities. How do we help, them understand and pick and choose? And I think a lot about, I know you have to evaluate programs, right? But we have standalone organizations. And we also have programs that could be implemented through existing organizations. And it feels like as we consider all this, somehow we've got to help communities, funders, school districts, nonprofits, help them figure out good questions around fit. How do you make the right decisions for you? I don't know, to the degree to which that, that fits within, what IES does or it's your mission, but I think we need to somehow help the field make those sort of practical decisions around fit. And then the last thought I have is just really thinking again about what's happened with the, all the incredible work that's gone around vaccines. I know we have traditional ways of evaluating programs, and I'm a big believer in evidence-based experimental studies. But I wonder if we need to think about in this current year, sort of like an emergency use, what's the EU, the A stands for, the emergency use, rule or whatever, because, we actually have been for the last couple of years promoting and supporting an evidence-based fluency intervention called HELPS. And I was curious about why doesn't it show up on any of the databases? And so I went to Bob Slavin's data evidence for ESSA, and it says it hasn't met the criteria. And when I looked at the criteria, I figured out why. You have to have 2 classrooms, I think, and at least 30 students per treatment condition. That's 60 total. This particular one has 4 RCTs, 1 quasi-experimental, and doesn't quite meet that benchmark. I wonder if under our current environment, just like as we're thinking about these other vaccines, maybe we need to also think about how we review some of these. And, as we're trying to develop more confidence, as you were suggesting, and getting rapid information, do we also need to think about what might be an emergency use authorization for evidence or promising interventions that groups think about as we're trying to figure this out?
Mark, you want to respond to some of what
Yeah,
Monroe
of course.
said? I see you do. I see you do.
I was waiting for you. I didn't know if I should have just started.
You're up.
Okay, so the issue of fit for me is like the most important thing. There's no question about it. And we need, and I'm trying to across all the work that we're doing in IAS to do two things. One is to, what works for whom under what conditions, and we have to drive much more down to the issue of fit. So the question then for me is, when we get down to the fit issue, what are we really trying to do? So there are two things. So the first thing is we're trying to improve the bet, right? So my goal is to say, if you're in this cube, right, this intersection of grade, subject, demography, and you could find research that is in the same box that you are in, and it says, look, for your school, for this subject, for this grade, for this problem fluency or whatever, here are the things that we know, and this is the best bet for you, or here are 3 things that may be the best bet. Okay, and all we could do, what works is such a complicated term because most things don't work, and very few things work for everybody. So what we're trying to do is to, in my mind, what we're trying to do is give probabilities, right? It may not work. It may not work, but if you're going to bet you're going to bet some kids' lives and you're going to bet some money, the best thing you could do is look at these 3 programs, because the evidence is that one of these 3 programs is the evidence shows that this is the best bet for you. So we really need to change from what works to really what's the probability that it will work, and emphasize the highest probability, the highest probability. And we need to do this fast. And this is why the digital learning platforms and trying to figure out how to deliver tutoring via these platforms is really so important, because the standard model of 5 years, $5 million for an RCT, and the end result is failure, is not really a sustainable model. So what would happen if we had tested one vaccine? We ran it for 3 years, it didn't work. Then we did another vaccine, ran it for 3 years, that didn't work. And then another one. And then finally we found one. So we can't do sequential. We cannot do sequential testing. This is why we've been pushing replication work, because we have to do things simultaneously. And we have to do replications and more replications and more replications. And for me, the fastest way to do that is going to be via these via platforms. And the goal again is to try to figure out what the best bets are. So Monroe talked about, and this is so fundamentally important, how do we involve parents? How do we involve communities in this? So Ralph is maybe in the audience, maybe he didn't show up, but
Yes,
anyway.
he is.
But the point, so when I started talking to Ralph, it was the fact, he said, well, I have several hundred communities that are, that are part of the coalition, part of the campaign. And I'm thinking like, wow, what would happen if we partnered with an organization like the campaign that had hundreds of communities that would ease our entry into communities and allow us better communication with parents, for example, better communication with a wider range of stakeholders than just the normal way in which we do business. So we're thinking about this. We're trying to figure out how to do that kind of community engagement. We're a small organization. We don't have the capacity to do that directly, but we should be in the business of partnering with organizations that do have the community reach and the community partners to try to figure out how we could do the systematic testing across different communities. So we, unfortunately, COVID came along and stopped our investigation into PCORI, which is a patient-oriented site within the, I don't know if it must be HHS pays for it, but that's a model that's very successful in terms of getting patients involved in identifying problems, issues, protocols, and part of their model is to make sure that the patient voice is heard as they discuss medical interventions. So we have reached out to PCORI again after some hiatus, and we're going to try to figure out if there's a model there that could help us with figure out how to do exactly what Monroe talked about, right? There are many different kinds of communities. We need parents, we need communities to help do this. I mean, it's a lot of work, it's expensive, and we need to figure out how to do it. And we can't do it, we have to do it with partners.
So I want to ask both Mark and Monroe about the sort of the implementation science part of this and the way the marketplace works and the way that money works. All of that works in a way that is not like the vaccine. It's higgly-piggly, it's not dependable, all of those things. So we talk about, you talk about, Mark, programs, which doesn't necessarily have to be the same as an organization. Like a big organization can deliver a program inside of its larger model. But we know how difficult that is across all the different kinds of communities and all the different people who run these agencies and so forth. So even if you were able to distill, like, here are the 5 essential factors, and if you do these things in the right way, you increase the odds. I like the way you say that. It's no certainty. It's not a vaccine. And we should never probably talk about things in the world of education as vaccines. But how do you then get the implementation to a level of fidelity that means that those odds, remain increased? How do you think about that, Monroe? I know how hard you've thought about all these issues across a couple of communities, and you've seen the variations. And as we think about trying to do this, especially as Mark suggests, for those kids who are struggling the most, the stakes are the highest, the kids are struggling the most. We really want to increase the odds that what we are doing is working for those young people. How do we think about that when we think about all the challenges of implementation science and the way this market works?
So it's an interesting question. I actually still think the vaccine, I'm going to push back. I think it applies because what's interesting is, and I agree with Mark 100%. I think about this in terms of probability, and even if you look at the flu vaccine, it's not 100% effective, right? There's some probability behind it, right? So, but it's interesting. It's almost like you've been in my team meetings recently. So, I'm going to feel like I'm on this pandemic kick, but I've been for the last 8 weeks really taken by this notion of the Swiss cheese model, right? And I've been reading a lot about high reliability systems, and there's this notion of building a reliable system out of unreliable components, right? And it simply means nothing's perfect. But the idea is that if you imagine the interventions that we're putting in place, tutoring is one, right? That it's not perfect. They got holes in them like Swiss cheese. And the whole idea is to focus on harm reduction, right? And so what we're in our business at the campaign, harm is a child finishing 3rd grade who's not reading proficiently. So we're trying to stack and align a series of interventions such that we don't want the holes to all line up so that a kid falls through. So you think about any of these as a barrier, defense, or safeguard against harm. None of them are perfect, but you're thinking very carefully about how do you construct them together. So the fidelity of implementation is important because you're trying to create the reliability of whatever that program is. But I think it takes off the burden of anything having to be perfect, because it's not. There's no 100% probability that it will work for everyone. It won't. But if you think about the idea of kind of trying to construct a reliable system, out of unreliable parts, it's helpful. And in the reliability science field, they consider level 1 reliability 1 or 2 accidents out of 10, right? Or incidences of harm. Now, if you're talking about airplanes, where reliability is really important, every 10th airplane falling out of the sky is horrible. But in our business, where you've got 6 out of 10 children experiencing harm at the end of 3rd grade, not reading well, and we reduce that down to 1 or 2, we're considering that in our business, that's a success. So I think it's how can we think about tutoring? And I think the other things Mark was talking about as well is part of kind of a series of layers of defenses, barriers, and safeguards, none of which are perfect, but we're trying to increase the probability, right, that we're catching kids before they fall through 3rd grade and are not reading well.
I love that. Mark, I'll ask you in a second for your reaction to that. But my reaction, Monroe, is that's pretty much like parenting.
Yes.
You don't actually know which thing is going to work for your kid. So you do everything, and some stuff works for one kid and some stuff works for another kid, but you have enough, different things going on that you just hope that it works. Sadly, we don't like to actually think about other people's kids the way we think about our own kids. And we want these high efficiency approaches. My favorite example is parents like we were do not do an RCT on whether participation in soccer works for our kids. Our kids play soccer. Sometimes they love it, sometimes they don't. But if we're going to deploy soccer for other kids, likely poor kids growing up in challenging circumstances, we want really reliable scientific evidence that quote unquote soccer works.
Right.
And so it's a big challenge. I get it. We're talking about public money. We're talking about, taxpayer funds. But at the same time, we have to be realistic. And Mark, you suggested this, not everything, even the highest fidelity delivery of a really high quality thing is not going to work for a bunch of kids. We know this. And how do we think about that? And how do we go forward with that knowledge?
That's a really tough question, right? It's usually when
You're
people
the expert.
Yeah, so I'm supposed to say that's a good question, which means I have no idea. Give me a few minutes to think about an answer, right? I've noticed this is very common. So that's a really tough question, and so it really says that some kids are just going to fall through the cracks, and so I like Monroe's idea of minimizing the holes lining up. So if someone falls through one hole, they don't fall through 6 holes. So I like that analogy. I hope it actually works that way. We just have to, kids are going to be left behind. It's really sad, right? We've been trying for decades to bring kids up, and so the problem. So the most discouraging thing in the last year for me was the NAEP results that showed the decline of reading and math at the 10% level. I cannot. We have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on learning, on reading, right? We have a pretty good idea. We have a pretty good idea about how to teach reading. We have all brain science, we have fMRIs, we know phonics, etc. And it's just amazing to me that the best science, the science is not being used in many programs of reading, right? Emily Hanford's work on this is just stunning and stunningly depressing. So there have been times when I've listened to Emily and I've looked at our NAEP scores and I'm thinking wait a second, education science, hundreds of millions of dollars, the best brain science, the best cognitive science, fMRIs, the whole business, and still the 10% of the bottom 10% is getting worse off. For me, this is really depressing. Sorry, that was not an answer to your question. but as I said, a tough question. I'm not even sure I have an answer to that. I do want to add one more thing that is really important. So so we've been working at IAS with something called the SEER principles, and especially if you're trying to get money from us, you need to look at them. But one of them has to do with costs, right? So we've been pushing a lot for 3 years now, as long as I've been at IAS, about cost analysis and cost effectiveness analysis. And so most of the studies that I've seen with regard to tutoring don't study cost. And that's not acceptable, right? I mean, we sort of have a belief that we know one-on-one tutoring, which is probably the most effective, is obviously going to be the most expensive. We know that certified teachers, right? Certified teachers are probably the best tutors, but also most expensive. So to some extent, when we start experimenting with delivery systems, we have to monitor the cost. We have to monitor the cost and the cost effectiveness really carefully, right? Because I mean, you know, so something that has a 0.3 effect size is giant, but how much does it cost to do that? And if we save X numbers of dollars because we use one tutor to 2 students, 1 tutor to 3 students, 1 tutor to 4 students, like how much money are we saving? So we would have more money to do casting the net of tutoring further. So one of the things I'm concerned about is that tutoring works. We need a fix, right? We need it right now because of the learning loss, and we're just going to throw a bunch of money out, into tutoring programs. But we must monitor the effectiveness, and we must monitor the cost. It's our responsibility to do that.
Monroe, thoughts?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Mark. We paid a lot of attention to this. I've often thought about, I often think about this as buying outcomes. So when I look at those effect sizes and costs, I'll do some math there to figure out how much does it cost me, right, to buy that. We've done some benchmarking around tutoring costs, like what's the costs per student, right? And you can get the even more fine grain. But like I have a range, I was checking just before we started, from 230 roughly to about 1,800 per student. I've seen over 2,000. John, earlier you asked about, the finances. That's a real constraint. And so I think we also need to ask ourselves, how much, are we willing to spend or we can spend, and how do we, try to get what we can, the most impact we can out of it. Even when you think about Dosage, I know 2 different programs, decent effect sizes. One of them is one-on-one for 30 minutes, 4 days a week. The other is one-on-one, 15 to 20 minutes, 3 doses a week. And when you think about the implementation, right, and what you could get out of one volunteer for an hour, let alone if you pay them, it's very, very different, right, in terms of the cost and what you can get, let alone the effect sizes. So I think I think part of what we have to do is to help communities make decisions around these trade-offs, because the costs are different. And again, I go back to before, really thinking about standalone organizations versus programs that could be implemented.
Yeah,
that's something, communities are going to have to really think carefully about in terms of, what they're able to support. And then, anytime you bring something new in, it's not like the pie of, dollars have grown. So then it's going to squeeze something out. So I just feel like I've committed the sin in the past, not in Charlotte, back in Kansas City, of bringing new things to town and not thinking enough about, what does this mean for existing groups? So I do have a strong bias to trying to work with existing groups that we have here in Charlotte. So I'm really interested in program models that can be implemented through existing groups and to help them be able to deliver that effectively. But these are part of the trade-offs, and I couldn't agree more with Mark about this.
So I want to, on the cost thing, I have 2 thoughts that I wanted to share and maybe get Mark's reaction to. One is, there's nothing more costly than throwing a bunch of money at something that actually just doesn't work, right? Implementing a successful, expensive program is a lot more cost efficient than implementing a cheaper but totally ineffective intervention. That's one. The second is there is a little bit, I think, of a psychic cost that you expressed about the amount of resources that have been deployed to try to help those kids who are growing up in the most challenging circumstances and who are struggling for whatever reason to learn. And the more we deploy resources and don't see results, the more people feel like, well, this is inevitable, inexorable, unchangeable, and therefore we should give up. And they're not our kids anyhow, so we should give up. I don't know how to balance those things. I think it's really, really hard. But I worry that every time we start talking about costs, we just start talking about how to make it cheaper, which is not actually the way that a parent thinks about their own child's well-being. And if their kid is struggling, they don't go out and find the least expensive tutoring program. In fact, many of them, if you want to start a business trading on the anxiety of type A parents, they go out and find the most expensive program because they think that's the best approach. So how do we think about all that as we really, to your point, Mark, zero in on those young people who are struggling the most profoundly and who are most at risk for getting lost in this system and not lost for a minute?
Right. So, so this is this is where cost effectiveness analysis comes in, right?
Yeah.
So, yes. So what happens if we find a tutoring program that costs? I think Monroe's example went to over $2,000 per child.
Yep.
Well, that means we're going to be able to do fewer children.
Yep.
Right. And what happens if we find a $1,200 a year program that the effects are just as good, or maybe a little smaller, right? So this is why we have to estimate the cost of everything, because the schools, school districts, states all live within confined budgets, right? Limited budgets.
Absolutely.
I've been pushing on this from the day I showed up at IAS. We cannot say this works without telling the school or school district, this is how much it's going to cost, right?
Right.
Everybody lives with constrained budgets, right? So how can we say this is the best? This is the best thing, and we're not, and it costs $5,000 a student, $10,000 a student, and you don't have that kind of money.
Right.
So the other thing, which I hope we could continue talking about, is let's assume that we put these tutoring programs in place, that we do both the cost and the effectiveness analysis that I think is essential. But how do we communicate that?
Right.
We do a terrible job. IAS in particular does a terrible job in taking scientific knowledge, which is scarce enough, and bringing it to market, if you will, and doing the last mile problem of telling people, hey, this is what the science says, right? This is your best bet. We don't even do things like that. So we need plain language. We need intermediaries like the campaign to help us translate stuff into news that parents could use, or that principals or superintendents could use. To say we're a science agency, and therefore we could use obtuse language is not useful. We're an applied science agency, and the work that we do has to be translated into things that policymakers could easily understand, that even parents could easily understand. And that's why we're spending much more money on dissemination than before, because we have to figure out how to disseminate information in a way that's usable.
Monroe, curious, from your perspective, Kansas City, Charlotte, but GLR, the community writ large, how would you respond to that challenge that Mark just laid out around, actually, we do know a bunch of stuff. We don't know everything, but we know a bunch of stuff, and people are spending a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of energy on things that we think, to go back to your language, Mark, have a high probability of not working. And you seem so how to answer Mark's question, what would it take? What would it look like for people to be more responsive to things that are demonstrated to have impact, to understand the science and apply it?
I think, at the heart, we're making purchase decisions. Like I often think about, we're trying to buy outcomes when we fund programs.
Yep.
But what's strange is the market we're in is not like markets we see in other places. If I go onto Amazon, I see lots of reviews. It's not just the product description, but I'm learning from other people that have purchased it. If I'm looking for a new car, there's no way I'm buying a car without looking at reviews and what people have
Right.
said. And even earlier today, I reached out to my friend Mike English in Kansas City and said, "Hey, someone in Charlotte's asking about this program. I know you have it. What's your experience?" Well, that's a private communication on a text message, but it's hard for people to be able to make these decisions. And I think about a conversation I had with a school leader here in Charlotte 2 years ago, and we were talking about tutoring, and she said to me, "Monroe, I didn't do anything with tutoring because all these groups were making claims and I had no way of making a decision or knowing, is it good, is it not good? So I just did nothing." And, I told her, "Hey, it's not your fault. This is really hard to find this information." She doesn't know what an effect size is or what it means.
Right.
But somehow she needed, and I know if she had the right information, she could have mobilized the resources and the other things. She just didn't know what to look for. And so in a world where, everyone's claiming now to be evidence-based, that was the big switch with ESSA, right? Everything was research-based and now everybody's evidence-based. And the most egregious is ones where I know, for example, that the review says no impact or no studies that meet the criteria, and yet they claim to be evidence-based. Well, who's going to read all that, right? But but that's what the consumers need. And I think if there are ways that we can help them better understand, and to Mark's question, the fit, how do you know if this is right for you? And I think the implementation science questions, John, that you raised are so important. And I think if we could get closer to helping them make the purchase decision, and the purchase is serious, right? I mean, Bob Slavin last time said, we got to be sure if you're going to invest that this, this is going to, have a high probability of working. How can we help them better understand what's the right purchase for me? Just like when I go onto Amazon and figure out what to buy for my wife.
Yeah. Great. Fantastic. Ralph, I'm glad you put on your suspenders and turned on your screen. I see that we're a couple minutes to 4, and I just, on a Friday afternoon, I want to turn it to you to close us out. And Monroe and Mark, I can tell the three of us could talk for a really long time, and I enjoyed it. You guys were both tremendous, and I appreciate it. I apologize that we didn't get to engage the audience more. I wish we had been able to, but you guys were on fire. It's just terrific. Ralph, to you.
Well, at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, I've got to first thank all three of you. This has been an outstanding conversation, and I could have listened to another hour of it. And I'm really grateful, as you said at the outset, for how many people stayed on for this call. As we pivot to taking on and leaning into this learning loss recovery issue, the Campaign for Grade Level Reading is exploring a number of options. And our hope is in the next 18 months, we're going to be able to work with many people on this call and many of our other partners to mount a robust enough effort that the recovery from learning loss will not mimic what we've seen in other disasters. And that is the recovery takes a decade. We've got young children whose lives are at stake, and we have got to figure out a way to have an accelerated recovery. And that recovery starts with the planning and the good thinking we do now. And I'm really grateful to you, John, for your leadership, not only with respect to these particular webinars and exploration, but your leadership on the whole. And I'm grateful to Mark and Monroe and the dozen people who've really come in as panelists and lending us the benefit of their wisdom and their experience as we try to carve a path forward. So thank you all. Enjoy your weekend. stay connected with us and help us do what we're hoping to do, and that is make a contribution to helping this generation of kids heal from what McKinsey and Company calls the hurt that could last a lifetime. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.